I swear by the 3 moons of Centauri, if one more person calls humans primitive Deathworlders, I'm going to demonstrate exactly why we earned that reputation. Zeke Morrison muttered under his breath, adjusting his environmental suit settings as he strode through the gleaming corridors of Starbase Nexus 7. The space station's artificial gravity was set to the galactic standard of 0.7 Earth gravity, making his movements appear unusually bouncy to the various alien species watching him pass. Their subtle tentacle twitches and antenna flicks didn't escape his notice. 15 years as a xenobiologist had taught him to read alien body language like a children's book. "Ah, the human arrives," announced Dr. Crooksstick, their multiple eye stalks swaying in what Zeke had long ago learned was their species' equivalent of an eye roll. The arthropodian scientist chitin gleamed under the station's lights as they addressed the assembled research team. Though I must question the wisdom of including a representative from such a developing world. Zeke bit back a sigh. The conference room was filled with the galaxy's supposedly finest xenobiologists, all of whom were giving him looks that ranged from diplomatic discomfort to outright disdain. A Floatian researcher actually elevated themselves an extra meter away from him, their gas-filled body rippling with concern. Dr. Morrison's credentials are quite extensive, defended Dr. NX, a luminarian whose bioluminescent patterns flickered in academic interest. At least someone was on his side. His work on the behavioral patterns of the Jovian thunder beasts was groundbreaking. Yes, interrupted Professor Isaacs, their crystalline form refracting light in patterns of skepticism. But this is hardly the place for brute force approaches. We are discussing the most sophisticated predatory species ever discovered. It requires delicacy, advanced technology, proper scientific— You mean the same proper scientific approaches that got 3 research teams eaten? Zeke couldn't help himself. The words burst out before his diplomatic filter could engage. Because those worked out so well. The room fell silent. Even the ambient hum of the station's life support systems seemed to quiet down in response to his outburst. Professor Isaacs's crystalline surface frosted over, a sign of extreme agitation in their species. "Tell me, Professor," Zeke continued, pulling up holographic data on his ARM computer. "Did any of your teams even consider that the creature might be using infrasonic communication? Because that's basic predator behavior where I come from. You know, on that primitive Deathworld you're all so quick to dismiss." Dr. Crooksstick's mandibles clicked rapidly, their species' version of nervous throat clearing. "And I suppose you have a better approach?" "Actually," Zeke smiled, and several alien researchers instinctively backed away at the sight of his exposed teeth. "I do. You see, while you've all been trying to study this apex predator from a safe distance with your fancy remote drones and sensor arrays, you've missed something crucial." He expanded the hologram, showing comparative gravity readings. "This beast evolved on a planet with 1.1 Earth gravity. And you know who else evolved to hunt apex predators in high gravity?" The Floatian researcher drifted even higher, their gas sacs pulsing with anxiety. "Surely you're not suggesting—" "That's exactly what I'm suggesting." Zeke's grin widened. "Sometimes the best way to study a predator is to think like one. And lucky for you all, you've got a genuine Deathworlder right here who's been doing that his whole life." The assembled scientists erupted into a chaos of protests, clicks, whistles, and electromagnetic pulses of alarm. Dr. NX's bioluminescence had brightened to almost painful levels, while Professor Isaacs was practically crackling with crystalline stress patterns. Zeke just leaned back in his chair, reinforced to handle his excessive Earth-evolved mass, and watched the show. Sometimes the best way to handle academic politics was to throw a proper Deathworlder-sized wrench into the works, and he had a feeling this was just the beginning. Once the initial chaos subsided, Dr. NX activated the central hologram projector. The room darkened as a massive creature materialized in the air before them. Zeke leaned forward. Professional interest peaked, despite himself. "We call it the Shadow Stalker," Dr. NX explained, their bioluminescent patterns pulsing with excitement and fear. First discovered on NGC 457 3 standard cycles ago. Every attempt to study it has ended in, they paused, patterns dimming, catastrophic failure. The hologram rotated, showing a beast that made Earth's ancient apex predators look like stuffed toys. Its body was roughly the size of a small shuttle, covered in what appeared to be overlapping plates of natural armor. 6 limbs, each ending in retractable claws that would make a titanium mining drill jealous. But it was the head that really caught Zeke's attention, or rather heads. 3 neural centers, he mused aloud, earning surprised looks from his colleagues. Independent processing power probably allows for complex hunting strategies. Those sensor pits along the neck ridges, heat detection? Correct, Professor Isaacs admitted reluctantly, their crystalline form shimmering with data patterns. The creature possesses multiple redundant hunting systems, thermal detection, electromagnetic sensitivity, and something we haven't quite identified yet. The first research team sent in remote drones. Dr. Crack's tick clicked, mandibles twitching at the memory. The Shadow Stalker detected and destroyed them all within minutes. They appeared to amuse it. Second team tried a cloaked observation post, added the Floatian researcher, drifting nervously. The creature not only found it, but seemed to understand exactly how the cloaking technology worked. It played with the field generators before destroying them. And the third team? Zeke asked, though he could guess from their reactions. Dr. Enix's bioluminescence flickered in a pattern of mourning. They attempted direct observation from what they believed was a safe distance. The team's ship was rated for deep space exploration with military-grade shields. Let me guess, Zeke interrupted. They found out those plates aren't just for show. The hologram shifted to show footage from the third expedition. The Shadow Stalker moved with impossible speed for its size, launching itself at the research vessel. Its armor plates shifted, revealing what looked like organic weapon ports. The recording ended in a blast of biological plasma that would have made Earth's defense engineers weep with envy. The creature appears to be biomechanical in nature, Professor Isaacs explained. It can reconfigure its body structure for different combat scenarios. Our analysis suggests it may be the result of ancient genetic engineering, though by whom? Hold up, Zeke raised a hand. You're telling me this thing is basically a living Swiss Army knife of death, can think with 3 brains simultaneously, and might be some kind of abandoned superweapon. And your solution was to keep sending increasingly expensive equipment for it to play with? We have exhausted all standard scientific approaches, Dr. Karakstick admitted. The Galactic Science Council is considering declaring NGC 457 a prohibited zone. Zeke stood up, walking around the hologram. The creature tracked his movement with all 3 heads, even in this recorded form. He could swear it looked curious. You know what I see? He said finally. I see a predator that's bored out of its 3 minds. You keep sending it toys, and it keeps breaking them because that's all they are to it, toys. It's not hostile, it's understimulated. And what would you suggest? Professor Isaacs's tone dripped with sarcasm crystals. I suggest you let me go talk to it. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the station's ambient noise seemed to hold its breath. That, Dr. Karak's tick finally managed, would be suicide. Zeke shrugged. Maybe. But here's the thing about coming from a Deathworld. You learn that sometimes the best way to understand a predator is to meet it on its own terms. Besides, he grinned, making several researchers flinch, I've always wanted to arm wrestle a living weapon. The Floatian researcher actually fainted, their gas sacs deflating with a soft whoosh as they sank to the floor. The station's equipment bay looked like a cross between a military armory and a scientist's garage sale. Zeke moved through the aisles of high-tech gear, occasionally picking up items only to set them back down with a shake of his head. You cannot be serious, Professor Isaacs crystallized in disbelief as Zeke passed by the latest in force field technology. That's a Mark 7 personal shield generator. It could withstand a direct hit from a small warship. And it would make me about as agile as a drugged rhinoceros, Zeke replied, continuing his seemingly random selection process. Besides, if our friend out there can punch through military-grade ship shields, what makes you think a personal shield would do any better? He tossed a few items into his collection cart: basic climbing gear, a medical kit, and what looked like a primitive projectile weapon. Dr. NX's bioluminescent patterns swirled in confusion. That's an ancient kinetic launcher, they protested. We have plasma weapons that the creature has already shown it can counter, Zeke interrupted. Sometimes older is better, especially when dealing with something that might be expecting high-tech threats. He added a few more items: water purifiers, nutrient packs, and what appeared to be a children's toy from Earth, a simple rubber ball. Dr. Cruxtick's mandibles clicked rapidly in what Zeke had learned was their version of hysterical laughter. Now you're just mocking us. Every item has a purpose, Zeke said, patting his collection. You'll see. Now about transportation. The journey to NGC 457 took 3 standard days in the research vessel Empirical Dawn. Zeke spent most of it reviewing the detailed reports of the previous expeditions, while his alien colleagues spent it watching him as if he might spontaneously combust. The first team's mistake, he explained during one of their strategy sessions, was assuming the Shadow Stalker hunts like your species' predators. Look at this footage again. He played back the drone attack sequence. See how it doesn't just destroy them? It studies them first, learns their capabilities. That's not just predator behavior, that's problem-solving intelligence. The second team's cloaking failure is even more interesting, he continued, switching footage. It didn't just find them. It reversed-engineered their technology through observation alone in 3 hours. The Floatian researcher, who had finally recovered from their fainting spell, drifted nervously. That's why we believe it's artificially enhanced. No natural creature could— Wrong again, Zeke shook his head. Earth octopi can figure out child-proof jar locks in minutes. Intelligence isn't unique to engineered species. You're also convinced this thing is some kind of ancient superweapon that you're missing the obvious. And what, pray tell, is obvious? Professor Isaac's crystalline form sparkled with skepticism. It's lonely. The research team stared at him, as if he'd grown a second head. Think about it, Zeke continued. A creature with that level of intelligence, possibly the last of its kind, stuck on a planet where nothing can challenge it. The only interaction it gets is with toys it can break. No wonder it's been escalating its responses. Dr. NX's patterns shifted to a thoughtful hue. You think it's seeking engagement, not just hunting. Exactly, which is why— Zeke was cut off by the ship's proximity alert. They had arrived. NGC 457 filled the view screen, a world that looked remarkably like Earth might have during its more violent evolutionary periods. Heavy gravity, dense atmosphere, active tectonics. In other words, a Deathworlder's paradise. Initial scans show the Shadow Stalker is in its usual territory, Dr. Karlextik reported, their appendages dancing across the control panel. We can deploy you at a safe distance. Nope, Zeke said, shouldering his peculiar collection of gear. Put me down right in the middle of its hunting ground. That's madness. Professor Isaac's surface frosted over completely. The previous teams tried to hide, study from afar, or fight. I'm going to do something completely different. Zeke checked his equipment one final time. I'm going to introduce myself. As the landing pod prepared for deployment, he could hear his colleagues placing bets on how quickly he'd be eviscerated. He smiled. They still didn't understand what it meant to come from a death world. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do with a predator was try to avoid it. The pod doors sealed, and Zeke began his descent toward what might be either the greatest xenobiological breakthrough in history or the galaxy's most interesting way to die. The landing pod's door hissed open, and Zeke stepped into an atmosphere thick enough to make even his Earth-evolved lungs work overtime. The gravity pulled at his muscles pleasantly, just a touch heavier than home. Heat shimmed off the rocky terrain in waves, while distant volcanic vents painted the sky in shades of burnt orange and toxic green. Someone really needs to talk to your tourism board, he muttered into his comm unit, earning several clicks of disapproval from the orbiting research team. He'd barely taken 3 steps when he saw the first sign, a massive paw print melted into solid rock. The shadow stalker had heated its claws to literally melt its way across the terrain. Show off. Territorial marking through environmental manipulation, he commented, professional habits kicking in. Demonstrates not just intelligence, but an understanding of psychological warfare. It's not just leaving tracks, it's leaving a message. What message would that be? Dr. NX's voice crackled through his comm. Simple. It's saying, I can melt rock. Imagine what I'll do to you. Zeke grinned, pulling out his rubber ball. Well, 2 can play at psychological games. He bounced the ball once, the simple action echoing off the rocky cliffs. Then again, and again. Each bounce sent a clear rhythm through the ground. What are you doing? Professor Isaac's voice was sharp with anxiety. You're deliberately attracting it. No, Zeke corrected, continuing to bounce the ball. I'm communicating. Regular rhythmic patterns don't occur naturally. I'm letting it know there's something intelligent here, something that wants to be found. A shadow passed overhead, too fast to track, but massive enough to momentarily block out the system's twin suns. Zeke kept bouncing the ball, even as his peripheral vision caught movement on 3 different sides. It's hunting you! Dr. Kirkstick's mandibles were clicking so fast they created static in the comm. Run! Nope, Zeke said calmly, though his heart was pounding with excitement. Running triggers prey response. I'm not here to be prey. The shadow stalker revealed itself with all the subtlety of a supernova. All 3 heads emerged from different directions, its armor plates shifting and realigning like liquid metal. It was even more impressive in person. Each head the size of a small car, with sensory pits that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. Its claws extended, still glowing hot enough to melt stone. Zeke caught the rubber ball one final time and held it up. Hello there, beautiful. Want to play catch? The creature's middle head tilted in a gesture so surprisingly Earth-like that Zeke almost laughed. Its right head snaked forward, sensor pits flaring as it analyzed him. The left head kept watch on their surroundings. This thing could multitask better than a quantum computer. Fascinating, Zeke breathed. The heads aren't just for show. You're running parallel processing, aren't you? One head for immediate analysis, one for environmental awareness, and one for... He paused as the middle head's eyes narrowed. Strategic planning. Well, aren't you just full of surprises? The shadow stalker's armor plates shifted again, revealing what looked like organic weapon ports. Zeke held his ground, even as his survival instincts screamed at him to run. Yeah, I've seen your light show, very impressive. But if you wanted to kill me, those plates would be firing already. You're curious. Probably the first time something walked right up and said hello, isn't it? The creature's middle head made a sound, a complex series of subharmonic rumbles that Zeke felt in his bones. The right head was still scanning him, its sensor pits pulsing in patterns that reminded him of Dr. NX's bioluminescence. It's attempting to communicate. Dr. NX's voice was thick with excitement. The patterns matched known sentient. Whatever else they were going to say was cut off as the shadow stalker suddenly moved. It was faster than anything that size had any right to be. One moment it was 20 meters away, the next it was right in front of Zeke, all 3 heads surrounding him in a triangle of teeth and sensors. Zeke's response was to bounce the rubber ball off the middle head's nose. The creature froze in what could only be described as absolute confusion. Its weapon ports partially closed, and all 3 heads tracked the ball as it bounced away. See? Told you I wanted to play catch. Zeke took a calculated risk and turned his back on the creature, walking slowly to retrieve the ball. Though if you're not interested, I suppose I could... The ground shook as the shadow stalker pounced, not at him, but at the ball. Its right head snatched it up with surprising gentleness, examining it with obvious curiosity. Oh, you want to see how it works? Zeke asked casually, as if he wasn't standing next to enough teeth to stock a sword shop. Here's the really cool part about rubber balls. They bounce higher in stronger gravity. The creature's middle head rumbled again, this time in a pattern that might have been interest. The right head delicately dropped the ball, and all three heads watched in fascination as it bounced higher than it would have on Earth. "Your move, big guy," Zeke said, catching the ball on its descent. "Want to see what else I brought to play with?" The Shadow Stalker's response was to lower all three heads to his level, sensor pits pulsing in what Zeke was pretty sure was the universal sign for "show me more." In orbit, the research team watched in stunned silence as the galaxy's deadliest predator began what appeared to be the universe's most dangerous game of fetch. Things were going great until the research team decided to get brave. After watching Zeke interact with the Shadow Stalker for several hours, Professor Isaacs made what would go down in xenobiology history as a monumentally poor decision. If the human can do it, surely we can gather direct observational data as well. Their crystalline form glittered with academic ambition as they piloted the shuttle down through the atmosphere. Zeke noticed the change in his new friend immediately. All three heads snapped up, weapon ports opening as its armor plates began to shift and realign. The playful curiosity vanished, replaced by something that made Zeke's Deathworlder instincts scream danger. What part of "don't come down here" was unclear. He growled into his comm. "Pull up, now!" Too late. The Shadow Stalker's entire body reconfigured, transforming from its relatively relaxed state into something that looked like a war machine's fever dream. Its middle head tracked the approaching shuttle, while the other two heads swiveled to cover potential escape routes. Fascinating. Dr. NX's bioluminescent patterns were practically strobing with excitement. It's displaying completely different behavior patterns from its interaction with the human. "That's because with me it was curious," Zeke snapped, slowly backing away from his transformed companion. "With you it's hunting, and you just volunteered to be prey." The Shadow Stalker launched itself skyward with explosive force, its weapon ports glowing with charged plasma. The shuttle's pilots finally realized their mistake and attempted to retreat, but they might as well have been standing still for all the good it did them. "All ships pull back," Zeke ordered, watching the creature execute a perfectly choreographed attack pattern. "It's not trying to kill you, it's herding you." He was right. The Shadow Stalker's plasma bursts didn't target the ships directly, but rather cut off their escape routes, forcing them into increasingly tight maneuvers. All three heads worked in concert, predicting and countering every attempted evasion. Dr. Cruxtick's mandibles clicked in panic over the comm. "The engines can't handle these gravity shifts. We need to—" A blast of plasma carved through space dangerously close to their ship's hull. The Shadow Stalker wasn't just hunting them, it was playing with them, like a cat with a particularly entertaining group of mice. "Emergency protocols enacted," Professor Isaacs announced, their crystalline voice cracking with stress. "All ships prepare for emergency warp jump." "You can't just leave." Zeke started to protest, but the ships were already engaging their warp drives. In a flash of displaced spacetime, the research team vanished, leaving him alone on the surface with a very agitated living weapon. The Shadow Stalker landed with enough force to create a small crater, all three heads swiveling to focus on Zeke. Its armor plates were still configured for combat, weapon ports humming with barely contained energy. "Okay," Zeke said slowly, raising his hands. "I know you're upset about the uninvited guests, but let's talk about this." The creature's middle head emitted that bone-shaking subharmonic rumble again, but this time it wasn't curious. It was angry. The right head's sensor pits pulsed with rapid patterns that Zeke recognized as combat calculations, while the left head kept perfect track of his every subtle movement. "Right. Talking might be off the table." Zeke carefully reached for his pack, never breaking eye contact with the middle head. "But I believe we were in the middle of something before we were so rudely interrupted." He pulled out his old-fashioned kinetic launcher, causing all three heads to focus on the weapon with predatory intensity. Then, to anyone else's absolute horror, he began to disassemble it. "See? Just parts, like a puzzle." He laid each piece out on the ground between them. and I bet someone as smart as you loves puzzles, especially ones that don't just roll around like a rubber ball. The Shadow Stalker's weapon ports powered down slightly. Its right head stretched forward, sensor pits analyzing the scattered components with obvious interest. The middle head's anger seemed to war with its curiosity. "That's it," Zeke encouraged, slowly stepping back from the pieces. "Something new to figure out. Much more interesting than chasing ships, right?" The creature's armor plates began to shift again, but this time they didn't reconfigure for combat. Instead, they settled into what Zeke recognized as its more relaxed configuration. The left head kept watching him, but the other two were now thoroughly distracted by the mechanical puzzle he'd laid out. "Clever human," he heard Dr. Enix whisper through his miraculously still-functioning comm. "You turned its predatory intelligence against its hunting instincts." "No," Zeke corrected quietly, watching as the Shadow Stalker began to delicately manipulate the weapon parts with surprisingly dexterous smaller appendages that emerged from its armor. "I just remembered what it's like to be the smartest and loneliest creature around. Sometimes you don't need prey. Sometimes you just need a challenge." The only question was, what would happen when it finished the puzzle? The Shadow Stalker finished assembling the kinetic launcher in exactly 6 minutes and 23 seconds. Then it did something Zeke hadn't expected. It took it apart again and rebuilt it 3 times. "Show off," Zeke muttered, but he was grinning. Right up until all 3 heads snapped toward him with predatory focus, and the weapon ports began to glow again. Oh, hell. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. You're not just showing off. You're saying you've solved this puzzle, and now you want a new one. The creature's middle head made that subsonic rumble again, but this time it held a note of challenge. Its armor plates shifted, weapon ports fully deploying. The message was clear. Playtime was over. Now it wanted a real challenge. "You know," Zeke said, already moving, "I really should have seen this coming." The first plasma blast hit exactly where he'd been standing a split second before. The Shadow Stalker wasn't trying to kill him. If it had been, he'd already be ash. No, this was something else. A test. Zeke sprinted across the rocky terrain, his Earth-evolved muscles working overtime in the heavy gravity. Another plasma blast superheated the ground near his feet, forcing him to change direction. The creature was herding him, just like it had done with the ships. But Zeke had something the ships didn't: Deathworld instincts, and enough knowledge of predator behavior to use them. "You want a challenge?" He reached into his pack while running. "Let's make this interesting." He pulled out a handful of small devices, basic signal emitters he'd modified from the station's equipment bay. The Shadow Stalker's right head immediately began scanning them, its sensor pits pulsing rapidly. Zeke threw them in different directions while continuing to move. The creature's heads tracked multiple targets now: the emitters, his movement, and the surrounding terrain. Its armor plates rippled with indecision. "3 heads are better than 1, Zeke panted, "unless you try to focus on too many things at once." The Shadow Stalker's response was to demonstrate exactly why it was considered the galaxy's apex predator. Its body literally split into 3 semi-independent sections, each head now mounted on a smaller but equally lethal body. "Okay," Zeke admitted, ducking behind a rock formation as plasma fire filled the air. "That's new." The 3 sections moved with perfect coordination, trying to cut off his escape routes. But they had to maintain some distance from each other to be effective, and that's what Zeke had been counting on. He triggered the emitters. Each one began broadcasting a different frequency, creating a triangulated web of conflicting signals. The Shadow Stalker's sensor pits flared in confusion as its 3 sections tried to process the contradictory information. "Fun fact about Earth predators," Zeke called out, using the momentary disruption to change position. "We learned pretty early that the best way to hunt something stronger than us was to make it fight itself." The creature's 3 sections struggled to remerge, its armor plates grinding against the competing neural inputs. But instead of disabling it as Zeke had hoped, the challenge only seemed to excite it more. The 3 sections stopped trying to reunite and instead fully embraced their separation. Now Zeke had 3 independently thinking predators to deal with. "Right!" he gasped, his muscles burning from the constant motion in high gravity. Time for Plan B. He pulled out his final piece of equipment, the medical kit, or more specifically, the synthetic adrenaline it contained, a dose designed for emergencies in high-gravity environments. Being a Deathworlder, he said, injecting the stimulant, isn't just about being tough. The synthetic adrenaline hit his system like liquid lightning. It's about being crazy enough to do what needs to be done. The Shadowstalker's sections had him surrounded, their weapon ports glowing with charged plasma. But now Zeke's body was flooding with enough stimulants to make an Earth cheetah jealous. He moved, faster than the creature expected, pushing his enhanced muscles to their limit. The Shadowstalker fired, but Zeke was already elsewhere, using the high gravity to his advantage. Each jump was precisely calculated. Each landing turned into a roll that carried him to safety. "Come on!" he challenged, his heart pounding with chemically enhanced courage. "You wanted a real hunt. Let's hunt!" The 3 sections responded with enthusiasm, their plasma fire turning the landscape into molten glass. But they couldn't predict Zeke's movements, because even he wasn't entirely sure what he was going to do next. Pure Deathworld instinct and artificial adrenaline drove him in patterns that defied logical prediction. And that's when he saw it. The segments were starting to tire. Operating independently cost more energy, and his erratic movements forced them to constantly recalculate and adjust. "Endurance hunting," he laughed almost manically as he dodged another blast. "Oldest human trick in the book." The Shadowstalker's sections began to slow, their movements becoming less coordinated. They were burning through energy trying to maintain their separation while matching his enhanced speed. Now came the really crazy part of his plan, the part that would either make xenobiological history or end up as a cautionary tale about humans and their ridiculous ideas. Zeke turned and charged directly at the middle section. The research station's medical bay had never been so crowded. Alien scientists packed the observation room, watching through reinforced windows as Zeke sat on an examination table covered in minor burns and sporting what would become some spectacular bruises. But he was grinning. Next to him, taking up most of the medical bay, lounged the Shadowstalker, fully reintegrated, and looking rather pleased with itself. "Let me get this straight." Professor Isaac's crystalline form sparkled with disbelief. "You charged directly at it?" "Yep." "While it was firing plasma weapons?" "Uh-huh." "And then you hugged it?" "Technically, I grabbed the central neural cluster and used my body weight to force the segments to reintegrate," Zeke corrected, reaching up to pat the creature's middle head. It rumbled contentedly. "But yeah, basically a hug." Dr. NX's bioluminescent patterns swirled with academic excitement. The physical contact must have triggered some kind of recognition response, perhaps a memory of social bonding from its species' history. "Simpler than that," Zeke explained, wincing as a medical drone treated a plasma burn. "It was a game of chicken, a test of nerve, and I proved I was crazy enough to be interesting." The Shadowstalker's right head nuzzled against him, nearly knocking him off the examination table. Its sensor pits pulsed in patterns that now seemed almost affectionate. "You realize this changes everything we thought we knew about apex predator behavior," Dr. Karakstick clicked excitedly. "The intelligence, the adaptability, the capacity for social bonding." "What it changes," Zeke interrupted, "is how you all think about intelligence. You were so convinced it had to be an engineered superweapon that you never considered it might just be lonely and bored." The creature's middle head made its subsonic rumble, but now everyone recognized it as something close to laughter. "The really funny part," Zeke continued, "is that you were all so focused on humans being Deathworlders that you missed what that really means. We didn't just evolve to survive. We evolved to understand survival, to empathize with other predators, to turn competition into cooperation." The Floatian researcher, who had been hovering nervously near the ceiling, drifted slightly lower. "You knew it wouldn't kill you, even when it split apart?" "Nope. I was pretty sure I was about to become the galaxy's most interesting chew toy. But that's another thing about being a Deathworlder. Sometimes you have to bet everything on understanding another predator's psychology. Professor Isaac's surface rippled with revelation. You made yourself the most interesting puzzle it had ever encountered. Got it in one, Zeke grinned, and now we have a research partner instead of a research subject. One that can probably teach us more about adaptive biology and parallel processing than we could learn in a century of normal study. The Shadowstalker's left head suddenly perked up. Its sensor pits flashing in a pattern that Zeke had learned meant it had an idea. It reached out with one of its smaller manipulator appendages and carefully picked up the rubber ball that had started it all. "What's it doing?" Dr. NX asked, as the creature's armor plates began to shift and reform. Zeke laughed. "It's showing off again. Watch." The Shadowstalker's plates rippled and flowed like liquid metal, eventually producing a perfect copy of the rubber ball, made from its own biomechanical material. "Now that," Zeke said, catching both balls as the creature dropped them, "is going to make one hell of a research paper." As the alien scientists erupted into excited discussion about the implications of biomechanical mimicry, Zeke leaned back against the Shadowstalker's middle head. "You know they're never going to leave us alone now, right?" The creature rumbled its subsonic laugh again. All three heads turned to watch the scientists with what could only be described as amused tolerance. "Yeah," Zeke smiled. "I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And maybe, just maybe, the galaxy will finally understand that being from a death world isn't about being the strongest or the most dangerous. Sometimes it's just about being crazy enough to give peace a chance." The Shadowstalker's agreement came in the form of another playful nuzzle that knocked Zeke completely off the examination table this time. Some things, it seemed, were universal, including the fact that every apex predator was, deep down, just a bit of a show-off.